Dust always came before trouble in Red Hollow. It rolled across the plains like a warning from the earth itself, sweeping through the crooked wooden streets and rattling the loose shutters of every building in town. The year was 1878, and Red Hollow sat like a stubborn scar between the endless golden grasslands of Wyoming Territory. Cowboys drifted through its saloons, outlaws sometimes hid in its shadows, and secrets had a way of burying themselves deep beneath the desert wind. But no secret in Red Hollow had ever been louder than the girl the town called a liar. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and if you asked anyone in town about her, they'd spit into the dust and say the same thing. Girl's crazy, or worse, she's lying. The rancher who stayed quite miles outside town, where the prairie stretched so wide it made a man feel small beneath the sky, stood Blackwood Ranch. It belonged to Caleb Hartley. Caleb was the kind of man people noticed even when he said nothing at all. Tall, broad-shouldered, sunburned, skin carved by years of wind and hard work. His dark hair fell loose beneath the brim of a worn leather hat, and his eyes carried the calm weight of someone who had seen more than he cared to remember. He rarely visited town, only when supplies ran low, or when whiskey ran out, or when loneliness got too loud. Most folks in Red Hollow respected him. Some feared him, a few envied him, but no one truly knew him, because Caleb Hartley carried a past heavier than the iron revolver on his hip, and he intended to keep it buried. The day everything changed, it happened on a late autumn afternoon, when the sky glowed copper and the wind smelled like rain. Caleb rode into Red Hollow on his black stallion. Midnight, the horse moved like a shadow across the dusty street. Men standing outside the saloon tipped their hats. Evan and Hartley. Caleb nodded but didn't slow. He tied Midnight to the hitching rail outside Morrison's General Store and stepped inside. The store smelled of flour, leather, and coffee beans. Afternoon. Caleb, old Mr. Morrison, greeted from behind the counter. Afternoon. Caleb gathered supplies quietly: salt, beans, rifle cartridges. It was peaceful until the shouting started outside. At first it sounded like ordinary town noise. Then a woman's voice broke through the air, desperate, angry, telling the truth. The words echoed through the street. Caleb paused. Outside, boots stomped across the wooden boardwalk. Someone laughed. Another voice shouted, "Go back to wherever you came from." Caleb stepped out of the store and saw her. The girl standing, Alan Clara Whitmore, stood in the middle of the street like a storm caught in human form. Her dress was dusty from travel. Her brown hair had come loose from its braid, whipping wildly in the wind, and her eyes were blazing with something fierce enough to silence a room. She looked young, too young to stand against an entire town. Sheriff Dalton stood near the saloon with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "You've caused enough trouble," the sheriff said. "Time to move along." Clara shook her head violently. "You don't understand," a man from the crowd shouted. "Then explain it again, sweetheart." More laughter. Clara's voice cracked but didn't break. "I saw him kill someone." The laughter stopped. For a moment, the town grew quiet. Sheriff Dalton sighed. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "you've told that story 3 times already. Because it's true. You're accusing one of the most respected men in Red Hollow." Clara pointed toward the far end of the street. "Thomas Grady murdered a man outside the canyon last night." Gasps spread through the crowd. Thomas Grady was standing right there beside the sheriff, rich ranch owner, town councilman, the man who had funded the new church roof. He smiled calmly, like a man who had nothing to fear. "That's a serious claim," Grady said smoothly. Clara's voice trembled. "I saw you. You've never met me before today. I saw your face." More murmurs from the townspeople. Grady turned to the crowd. "Does this girl have any proof?" Silence. Clara swallowed. That's what I thought," Grady said. The crowd shifted. Someone whispered, "Liar." Another voice joined. "She's making it up." Then loud, "Liar." The word spread like wildfire. Clara's shoulders trembled, but she didn't step back. The man who said nothing. Caleb Hartley watched everything from the edge of the street, silent, still, his expression unreadable. Clara turned slowly in a circle, searching the faces around her, looking for someone, anyone, who believed her, but every pair of eyes held doubt, or ridicule, or indifference, until she saw him, the rancher, standing alone beside his horse. For a moment their eyes met. Something flickered in Caleb's chest, because Clara Whitmore's voice, and the terror behind it, didn't sound like a lie. She stared at him desperately. "Please," she whispered, but Caleb said nothing. He looked away. The moment that broke, her Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. "Miss Whitmore, you need to leave town." "I won't," she said. "You're stirring trouble and telling the truth." The sheriff's patience snapped. "Enough." He grabbed her arm. Clara struggled. "Let go of me." A bottle smashed somewhere behind them. The town had turned ugly, angry. Thomas Grady shook his head sadly. "It's a shame," he said. "Poor girl's confused." That was when Clara shouted the words that changed everything. "I saw Caleb Hartley there too." The street froze. Caleb's heart stopped. Slowly, every head in town turned toward him. Sheriff Dalton frowned. "Hartley?" Caleb stood perfectly still. Clara pointed at him desperately. "He was there." The rancher's jaw tightened. Grady's smile vanished. For the first time, Caleb hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for it, and now the truth stood in the street. Staring straight at him, the sheriff stepped closer. "Hartley," he said carefully, "is that girl telling the truth?" Caleb looked at Clara. Her eyes were filled with fear, but also hope. The kind of hope that could ruin a man's life. Because Caleb Hartley knew something the town didn't. Clara Whitmore wasn't lying, and if he admitted that, everything he had built would burn to the ground. The ranch, his reputation, his freedom, maybe even his life. The entire town waited. Dust rolled across the street. A single horse whinnied somewhere behind them. Caleb's voice finally came, low, heavy. "Sheriff." He paused, and every soul in Red Hollow leaned forward to hear the answer. "She's telling the truth." The silence that followed felt like the world had stopped breathing, and Caleb Hartley knew he had just destroyed his life. For a long moment after Caleb Hartley spoke the truth, the entire town of Red Hollow stood frozen. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Dust hovered in the air, like it was waiting for someone to breathe. Again, Sheriff Dalton stared at Caleb as if he had just grown a second head. "What did you say?" the sheriff asked slowly. Caleb's jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hat. "You heard me," he said quietly. "The girl's telling the truth." The crowd erupted. Voices clashed together like thunder. "Impossible. Hartley's gone crazy. That girl's got him fooled." Thomas Grady's face had lost its easy smile. The rich rancher looked at Caleb with cold calculation now. For the first time since Clara arrived in town, someone important had believed her, and it was the last man anyone expected. Clara stared at Caleb like she couldn't quite believe what she had heard. You saw it too?" she asked softly. Caleb didn't answer her. Instead, he turned toward Sheriff Dalton. "I was riding back from the canyon last night," Caleb said. "Came across Grady arguing with a man." Grady's voice cut in sharply. "You'd better be careful what you're saying, Hartley." Caleb ignored him. There was shouting. Caleb continued. Then a gunshot. A murmur swept through the townspeople. Sheriff Dalton rubbed his beard. "You're saying you witnessed Thomas Grady murder someone?" Caleb's eyes flicked toward Grady for only a second. "Yes." The word landed like a hammer. But Grady didn't panic. He simply laughed. A smooth, confident laugh that rolled across the street. "Well now," Grady said, spreading his hands calmly. "If that's the story you want to tell, Caleb." The sheriff frowned. "You got proof?" Caleb hesitated. "Because the truth was heavier than the lie." "No," he said. Finally, Grady smiled again. "That's what I thought." The townspeople shifted uneasily. Now, it was 2 accusations against one respected man, and no proof. Sheriff Dalton sighed deeply, without evidence. This is just talk, he said. Clara's face fell. But the body. We haven't found any body, the sheriff interrupted. Grady stepped forward smoothly. I think it's clear what's happening, he said. This girl is confused. And Mr. Hartley here has let himself get tangled in her story. Several men nodded. Someone muttered. Sounds about right. Clara's voice trembled. You're all blind. No one answered her, because believing her would mean admitting something terrible had happened in Red Hollow, and towns like Red Hollow didn't like uncomfortable truths. Sheriff Dalton finally spoke again. Till we find evidence, he said. There's nothing I can do. Clara looked like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. But he killed a man, she whispered. The sheriff shook his head. Maybe. You both think you saw something, Thomas? Grady turned his gaze toward Caleb. There was no smile now. Only warning. You ought to be careful, Hartley, Grady said quietly. Stories like that can ruin a man. Caleb met his eyes. I already know. Grady's stare lingered for a moment longer. Then he tipped his hat and walked toward the saloon. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the whispers followed. Caleb-like. FLIs. Why'd he do that? Defending some stranger girl. Maybe he's lying too. Clara stood alone again in the middle of the street. Except this time, Caleb Hartley walked toward her. The ride into the prairie. Clara looked up at him nervously. You didn't have to say that, she said. Caleb untied Midnight from the hitching post. Yes, I did. You just made the entire town your enemy. Caleb mounted the horse. Wouldn't be the first time. Clara hesitated. Where am I supposed to go now? Caleb looked out toward the wide prairie. Beyond Red Hollow. You can't stay here, he said. I know. A long silence passed between them. Then Caleb held out his hand. Get on. Clara blinked in surprise. You're taking me with you? You got somewhere else to be? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Carefully, she took his hand. He lifted her onto the horse behind him, and just like that, the rancher, who barely spoke to anyone in town, rode out of Red Hollow with the girl everyone called a liar behind them. Dozens of suspicious eyes watched, and one pair of dangerous ones. Thomas Grady stood on the saloon porch, staring after them. His expression had turned darker than a thunderstorm. Life at Blackwood Ranch. Ride to Blackwood Ranch took nearly 2 hours. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, glowing gold beneath the fading sun. Clara had never seen land so wide, or silence so deep. The only sounds were hooves in the grass and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. Finally, a cluster of buildings appeared in the distance. A sturdy wooden house, a long barn, corrals full of horses. Blackwood Ranch. Caleb helped Clara down from the horse. You can stay in the spare room, he said. She looked around in amazement. You live here alone? Mostly. Couple ranch hands come through during cattle drives. Clara stepped onto the porch slowly. You really risked everything back there, she said. Caleb removed his hat. Didn't feel like watching them tear you apart. She studied him carefully. Why did you believe me? Caleb looked toward the horizon. Because the truth was complicated. Because the truth involved blood and guilt. I told you, he said quietly. Saw it, too. Clara exhaled in relief. Then I'm not crazy. No, but Caleb didn't look relieved. He looked troubled. Days turn into something. Moreover, the next week, life at the ranch slowly settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and sunrise over the prairie. Caleb worked the fences, checked cattle, and broke young horses. Clara insisted on helping. First Caleb refused. You'll hurt yourself. She crossed her arms stubbornly. I grew up on a farm in Kansas. Farm ain't the same as a ranch. Watch me. She proved him wrong. Quickly, Clara learned to saddle horses, feed cattle, repair fence lines, and ride across the open land with the freedom she had never known. One evening they rode along the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky burned orange and purple as the sun disappeared. Clara laughed as her horse galloped beside Caleb's. "You ever notice," she said breathlessly, "how the world feels bigger out here?" Caleb glanced at her. "Most folks think it feels lonelier." "Maybe it does." She slowed her horse. "But somehow, it doesn't feel lonely when I'm riding with you." Caleb didn't answer, but something warm flickered behind his quiet eyes. Because the truth was, Clara Whitmore had brought life back into a place that had felt empty for years, and Caleb Hartley was starting to realize something dangerous. He was beginning to care about her. The town turns against them, but peace in the Wild West never lasted long. One afternoon, Caleb rode into Red Hollow for supplies. The moment he stepped off his horse, he felt it. The town had changed. Men stopped talking when he passed. Women whispered behind curtains. Sheriff Dalton approached him outside the general store. "You made things real difficult for yourself, Hartley." Caleb shrugged. "I've had worse." The sheriff lowered his voice. "You're protecting that girl. She doesn't need protecting." Dalton shook his head. "Grady's got powerful friends." Caleb met his eyes. "So do I." The sheriff sighed. "You sure about that?" Before Caleb could answer, a rider came racing into town. His horse was lathered with sweat. "Sheriff!" the man shouted. Dalton turned. "What happened?" The rider slid off his horse. "Someone burned down the old Miller Ranch last night." The sheriff frowned. "That place has been empty for years." The rider swallowed. "Not last night." The street grew silent. "Someone found a body in the ashes." Sheriff Dalton's face darkened. Caleb felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Who was it?" Dalton asked. The rider looked around nervously, then said the name that made everything worse. "Man named Samuel Price." Clara's eyes flashed through Caleb's mind. Because Samuel Price was the man she claimed Thomas Grady had murdered. The body had finally appeared, but the truth was about to get far more dangerous, because if the town discovered where Clara Whitmore was hiding, they wouldn't come looking for answers. They'd come looking for blood, and somewhere in Red Hollow, Thomas Grady was already planning his next move. The news of the burned ranch spread across Red Hollow like wildfire in dry grass. By the time Caleb Hartley rode back toward Blackwood Ranch that evening, the sky was already bleeding into deep shades of crimson and purple, and a storm was built not in the clouds, but in men's hearts. Samuel Price's body had been found among the ashes of the old Miller Ranch. That meant one thing. Clara Whitmore had been telling the truth, and if the truth reached the wrong ears, Thomas Grady's carefully built reputation could collapse overnight. Caleb knew that men like Grady didn't let that happen. Men like Grady erased problems, and Clara Whitmore had just become the biggest problem in the territory. The ranch at dusk. When Caleb finally rode up the hill toward Blackwood Ranch, he spotted Clara standing near the corral fence. She was brushing one of the younger horses, her sleeves rolled up, and strands of hair falling loose around her face. For a moment, Caleb just watched her. It had been years since anyone stood waiting for him at the end of a long ride. Clara noticed him and waved. "You're late," she called. Caleb dismounted slowly. Town was busy. Her expression shifted. "That doesn't sound good." Caleb removed his hat and leaned against the fence. "They found the body." The brush slipped from Clara's hand. "Samuel?" "Yes." She looked down at the dirt. "I hoped maybe he'd gotten away somehow." Caleb shook his head. "The place he died burned down, too." Clara closed her eyes briefly. The guilt on her face made Caleb's chest tighten. "I tried to help him," she whispered. "You did, but I ran. You stayed alive." Clara shook her head. "Sometimes I don't know if that was the right choice." Caleb stepped closer. "Don't say that." She looked up at him. "Why not?" "Because if you hadn't run," Caleb said quietly, "Grady would have buried you beside him." The truth hung heavy between them. And then Clara asked the question Caleb had been avoiding. "Do they know I'm here?" Caleb hesitated. "Not yet." But the pause was enough. Clara swallowed. They will, yes. The wind rattled the wooden fence beside them. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. Caleb gave a quiet laugh. You're a little late for that. A dangerous truth hat night. They sat at the kitchen table inside the ranch house. A lantern flickered between them. Outside, the prairie had fallen into deep silence. Clara stared into the flame. There's something I didn't tell you, she said. Caleb leaned back in his chair. About what happened? Yes, you might as well say it. Clara took a slow breath. When I saw Grady kill Samuel, they weren't alone. Caleb's eyes sharpened. Who else was there? 4 men, outlaws? She nodded slowly. They looked like hired guns. Caleb's stomach tightened, because that meant the murder hadn't been a sudden argument. It had been planned. What were they doing there? He asked. Clara swallowed. I heard them talking before the shooting started. And they were arguing about land. Caleb frowned. What land? Clara looked up at him. Yours. The room went completely still. Caleb felt something cold crawl down his spine. What did you say? They mentioned Blackwood Ranch, Clara said quietly. They said once Samuel Price was gone, there'd be nothing stopping Grady from taking it. Caleb stood slowly from the table, because now the entire story made sense. Samuel Price had been a land surveyor, and if he had discovered something valuable beneath Blackwood Ranch, Grady would have wanted that land badly enough to kill. Caleb stared toward the dark window. You should have told me this sooner. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. Caleb turned back toward her. I already believed you. Their eyes met across the lantern light, and for a moment the tension between them changed into something softer, something deeper. Clara whispered, "You didn't have to." Caleb stepped closer. "Yes," he said. "I did." The first gunshot, the quiet shattered with the sound of a rifle shot. Crack. The lantern exploded. Glass shattered across the table. Clara screamed. Caleb grabbed her arm and pulled her to the floor. Another gunshot blasted through the window. Wood splintered. They found us, Caleb muttered. Outside, horses stomped and men shouted. A voice echoed across the yard. Caleb Hartley. Caleb recognized it instantly. Thomas Grady. Clara's face turned pale. Oh God. Grady's voice carried across the ranch. We just want the girl. Caleb grabbed his revolver from the table drawer. His voice was ice. You're not getting her. More riders circled the ranch house. Caleb peeked through the shattered window. 6 men. All armed. All waiting. Grady stepped forward into the moonlight. Don't make this difficult, Hartley, he called. You know how this ends. Caleb cocked the revolver. Yes, he said quietly. Do. Clara grabbed his sleeve. You can't fight 6 men. Caleb gave her a small smile. You ever hear the story of Blackwood Ridge? She shook her head. Caleb opened the back door slowly. They used to say this ranch belonged to a soldier who fought an entire cavalry troop alone. Clara stared at him. What happened to him? Caleb stepped into the darkness. They never found the bodies. Then the shooting started. Fire in the night. Gunfire exploded across the ranch yard. Caleb moved like a shadow between the barn and the house, firing from cover. One outlaw fell from his horse instantly. Another screamed as a bullet tore through his shoulder. Grady shouted orders, spread out. But Caleb knew the land better than any of them. He disappeared into the darkness, struck, then vanished again. Clara watched from inside the house, her heart pounding like thunder. The ranch had become a battlefield. Horses panicked, bullets tore through wooden walls, dust filled the air. Then suddenly, silence. The shooting stopped. Clara's chest tightened. Caleb? No answer. Outside, Boots stepped slowly toward the house. The door creaked open, and Thomas Grady walked inside. His revolver pointed straight ahead. Well now, he said calmly, looks like your hero finally ran out of luck. Clara backed away. You're not taking me. Grady smiled coldly. Oh, I don't need you anymore. Her heart skipped. What? Grady's eyes gleamed. The town already believes you're a liar. He raised the gun. But once they find your body here tonight, his finger tightened on the trigger, they'll believe something else entirely. Clara closed her eyes. The gun fired, but the bullet never hit her, because a shot rang out behind Grady, and the rich rancher collapsed to his knees. Caleb Hartley stood in the doorway behind him, gun smoking, eyes burning with fury. But as Grady fell to the floor, 3 more armed men stepped out of the darkness behind Caleb, and this time, the rancher had nowhere left to run. The night air over Blackwood Ranch smelled of gunpowder and fear. Thomas Grady lay bleeding on the wooden floorboards, his expensive coat dark with spreading blood. His revolver had rolled from his hand, and now rested near Clara's feet. For a moment, everything felt frozen in time. Then, the 3 gunmen behind Caleb Hartley stepped forward. One of them kicked Caleb's revolver away, another slammed the butt of his rifle into Caleb's back. The rancher staggered, but didn't fall. Clara rushed forward. "Don't hurt him." The tallest outlaw grabbed her arm and shoved her back against the wall. "Stay where you are, Miss." Grady groaned weakly on the floor. "Don't kill him," he rasped. The gunmen looked down at their wounded employer. "You sure about that?" one asked. Grady forced a crooked smile, despite the pain. "Oh, yes," he whispered. "I've got a much better idea." The trapped cautiously dragged Caleb into the center of the room. Blood ran down the side of his head from where the rifle had struck him, but he stood tall, breathing slow and steady. His eyes never left Clara. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded shakily. "Yes." Grady coughed and tried to sit up. One of the outlaws helped him against the wall. "You really should have stayed quiet, Hartley," Grady said weakly. Caleb stared down at him. "You killed that man." Grady shrugged slightly. "And now everyone will think you killed me." Clara's heart dropped. "What?" Grady laughed softly despite the pain. "You see, Miss Whitmore, you've been very useful." He gestured toward the shattered windows and the bullet holes in the walls. "When the sheriff arrives, he'll find a dead man in your ranch house." And Caleb Hartley holding the gun. Clara shook her head. "No one will believe that." Grady's eyes gleamed. "They already don't believe you." The cruel truth cut deeper than any blade. Because Grady was right. The entire town already thought she was a liar. Grady looked toward his men. "Take Hartley into town." Caleb tensed. "You won't make it." "Oh, I think we will," Grady said calmly. Then he looked at Clara. "And bring the girl too." The ride back to Red Hollow's sky was beginning to lighten when they rode into town. The prairie wind carried the cold scent of dawn. Caleb's hands were tied tightly behind his back. Clara rode beside him on another horse, guarded by one of the gunmen. Neither of them spoke, but their eyes met again and again during the long ride. Clara's chest felt tight with guilt. "This is my fault," she whispered finally. Caleb shook his head. "No, if I had never come here, they would have found another reason." She looked at him. "How can you be so calm?" Caleb stared ahead at the rising sun. "Because fear doesn't change what's coming." Red Hollow appeared on the horizon, and with it, their fate. The town turnspy the time they reached the main street. Half the town had already gathered. Sheriff Dalton stepped out of the jailhouse, confusion on his face. "What happened?" Grady's men dismounted quickly. "Sheriff, we found Thomas Grady shot at Blackwood Ranch." Gasps spread through the crowd. Dalton's eyes widened. "Where is he?" They lifted Grady carefully from his horse. The rich rancher looked pale and weak, but alive. "He tried to kill me," Grady whispered dramatically. Pointing toward Caleb, the crowd exploded with angry voices. "Hartley did it." "I knew something was wrong. That rancher's always been trouble." Clara stepped forward desperately. "That's not true," someone shouted back. "Here comes the liar again." The word echoed through the crowd. "Liar, liar, liar." Clara felt her heart breaking all over again. Sheriff Dalton approached Caleb slowly. "You shot him?" Caleb looked directly into the sheriff's eyes. "No," Grady groaned loudly. "He's lying." Dalton looked torn. Then he sighed heavily. "Take him to the jail." 2 deputies grabbed Caleb and dragged him toward the cell. Clara tried to follow, but someone in the crowd shoved her. Stay away from him. She stumbled into the dirt, and no one helped her up. Except one person, Sheriff Dalton. He offered her a hand quietly. You should leave town, he said. Clara shook her head stubbornly. I won't. Dalton studied her face carefully. Then, he said something that surprised her. Neither would he. The jailhouse conversation that night. Clara sat outside the jailhouse steps. The town had gone quiet again, but whispers still filled the air. Inside the cell, Caleb sat on the wooden bench, hands resting calmly on his knees. Clara approached the bars. Slowly. I'm sorry, she whispered. Caleb looked up. You said that already. They're going to hang you. Clara's voice cracked. I can't let that happen. Caleb stood and walked closer to the bars. The lantern light softened his features. You don't control what happens here, Abby. I do. Caleb frowned slightly. What do you mean? Clara hesitated, because she had been holding onto one final secret, one final truth. There's something I didn't tell you, she said. Caleb sighed quietly. I'm noticing a pattern. This one's different. She leaned closer to the bars. When Samuel Price died, he gave me something. Caleb's eyes narrowed. What? Clara reached slowly into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A land survey. Caleb felt his pulse quicken. What does it show? Clara unfolded it carefully. Gold. The word hung in the air. Under Blackwood Ranch. Now everything made sense. Grady hadn't just wanted the land. He wanted what was beneath it. Clara looked at Caleb with determined eyes. This proves everything. Caleb shook his head slowly. Or it gets you killed too. She smiled. Sadly, maybe. He reached through the bars and gently grabbed her hand. For the first time since they met, Clara felt how strong his hands really were. How did this happen? She whispered. Caleb looked into her eyes. Sometimes the truth costs more than a man expects to pay. Their hands lingered together for a moment longer, and in that quiet jailhouse, something deeper than survival passed between them. Love. Dangerous. Unavoidable. And now, possibly too late, because outside the jailhouse window, someone was watching them, and that someone had just realized something terrifying. The girl everyone called a liar was holding the one piece of evidence that could destroy Thomas Grady forever. Red Hollow had never been a quiet town, but that night, the silence felt wrong, heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. The moon hung low above the wooden rooftops, casting pale silver shadows across the dusty street. Most of the town had gone to bed, satisfied that the trouble was finally under control. After all, Caleb Hartley, the rancher who had accused Thomas Grady of murder, was sitting behind iron bars, and the girl they called a liar was sleeping in the boarding house under the watchful eyes of suspicious townsfolk, or at least, that's what everyone believed. But Clara Whitmore wasn't asleep. A girl who refused to run inside her small boarding house room. Clara sat on the edge of the bed with the folded land survey clutched tightly in her hands. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear, from determination. The lantern beside her flickered softly. As the wind brushed against the window, Clara stared at the map again. The survey lines were clear. Samuel Price had marked them carefully before he died. Beneath Blackwood Ranch, gold. Enough gold to change the fate of every ranch, town, and outlaw gang in the entire territory, and Thomas Grady had been willing to kill for it. Clara whispered to herself, "This ends tonight." She folded the paper and tucked it back inside her coat. Then she slipped quietly out the window. The sheriff's doubt across town. Sheriff Dalton sat alone inside the jailhouse office. A half-empty bottle of whiskey rested on the desk beside him. He stared at the cell where Caleb Hartley sat calmly. In the dim lantern light, "You don't look like a man about to hang," Dalton said. Caleb shrugged. "Worrying won't change anything." Dalton studied him carefully. "You know something don't sit right with me?" Caleb didn't answer. "That girl, Dalton continued. Clara Whitmore. What about her? Dalton leaned back in his chair. I've seen liars in this town for 20 years. He took a slow drink. She doesn't look like one. Caleb's voice stayed quiet. She isn't. Dalton sighed. Maybe. Before Caleb could reply, the jailhouse door creaked open. Both men turned. Clara Whitmore stepped inside. Her hair was loose, and her face looked determined. Dalton blinked. You're not supposed to be here. I know. What do you want? Clara placed the folded survey map on the desk. Dalton frowned and opened it. His eyes widened instantly. What in God's name? Caleb stepped closer to the bars. Dalton looked back and forth between them. This is real? Clara nodded. Samuel Price gave it to me before he died. Dalton rubbed his face slowly. Well, damned. For the first time, the sheriff looked truly worried. Grady's been lying to this whole town. Voice suddenly echoed from the doorway. Yes, all three of them turned. Thomas Grady stood alive, standing straight, and holding a shotgun. Behind him, 6 armed men, the betrayal sheriff. Dalton slowly stood. You shouldn't be walking around after getting shot. Grady smiled coldly. Turns out the bullet only grazed me. Clara's stomach dropped. Grady stepped forward. Thank you for bringing the map out into the open. Dalton's eyes darkened. You planned this. Grady shrugged. I suspected the girl had something valuable. He raised the shotgun slightly. Now, hand it over. Dalton hesitated. Grady's men raised their rifles. The sheriff sighed and placed the map on the desk. Grady grabbed it greedily. Finally, Clara's voice trembled with rage. You murdered Samuel for that? Grady looked at her calmly. Yes. The simple answer chilled the room. Caleb gripped the cell bars. You won't get away with it. Grady chuckled. Oh, I think I will. He turned to his men. Kill the rancher. Clara screamed. No. The gunmen raised their rifles, but before they could fire, Sheriff Dalton moved faster than anyone expected. He drew his revolver and shot one of Grady's men straight through the chest. Gunfire exploded across the jailhouse. Wood splintered, lanterns shattered, smoke filled the room. Dalton tossed the cell keys toward Caleb. Get out of here. Caleb caught them and unlocked the cell quickly. Another outlaw fired at Clara. Caleb grabbed her and pulled her behind the desk as the bullet shattered the wall. Stay down. The gunfight turned violent and chaotic. Dalton fired twice more. 2 men fell, but another shot hit the sheriff in the shoulder. He collapsed against the wall. Grady roared with anger. Kill them all. Caleb grabbed a fallen rifle. His eyes burned with cold fury. You should have stayed away from my ranch. Then he opened fire. The showdown in the street. Gunfight spilled out of the jailhouse and into the dusty street of Red Hollow. Townspeople woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting. Doors slammed. Windows flew open. Caleb moved like a man possessed. Years of ranch life and frontier danger had turned him into something dangerous. He fired from behind a water trough. Another outlaw fell. Clara grabbed a revolver from the ground. You know how to use that? Caleb asked. No. Point and pull the trigger. Grady retreated toward the center of the street. You're finished, Hartley, he shouted. Caleb stepped into the open. The moonlight reflected off his revolver. No, he said quietly. You are. The 2 men faced each other across the empty street. A classic Western standoff. Grady's hand twitched toward his gun. Clara held her breath. The entire town seemed to stop moving. Then, 2 shots fired at once. Bang, bang. Grady staggered backward. His gun slipped from his hand. He collapsed into the dust, dead. Silence fell over Red Hollow. Caleb lowered his revolver slowly. Clara ran toward him. You're alive. Caleb looked down at her, breathing hard. Barely. But their relief didn't last long, because behind them, Sheriff Dalton stumbled out of the jailhouse. Pale and bleeding, he looked at the dead men scattered across the street. then at Caleb. His voice was heavy with regret. You just killed one of the richest men in the territory. Caleb nodded. Yes. Dalton sighed deeply. That's going to bring a storm down on this town. Clara squeezed Caleb's hand tightly. Then we face it together. But none of them knew yet that the real storm was still coming, and the price Caleb Hartley would soon pay for telling the truth would be higher than anyone imagined. The sun rose slowly over Red Hollow the morning after the gunfight. Golden light spilled across the dusty street where broken wagons, shattered windows, and dark stains of dried blood told the story of the night before. The town had never seen violence like it. Thomas Grady, its richest rancher and most powerful man, lay dead. 5 hired gunmen were buried before noon, and Caleb Hartley, the quiet rancher who rarely spoke, had become the most dangerous man in the territory overnight. But to Clara Whitmore, he was the man who had saved her life. The morning after Clara stood outside the jailhouse, watching as men repaired the damaged buildings, Sheriff Dalton sat nearby with his shoulder bandaged, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. The folded survey map rested on the table between them. Proof that Thomas Grady had murdered Samuel Price. Proof that the fight for Blackwood Ranch had never been about pride. It had been about gold. Dalton rubbed his tired eyes. This map changes everything. Clara nodded. But will people believe it? Dalton looked toward the street where Caleb stood, speaking with 2 deputies. They believe him now. Clara followed his gaze. Caleb looked different this morning. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place stood a man who had faced death and walked through it. Dust clung to his boots. A bruise darkened his jaw, but his eyes still carried that calm strength Clara had come to trust. She whispered softly, almost to herself. They should have believed him from the beginning. Dalton sighed. May. Then he added quietly, but the law won't see it that way. Clara turned sharply. What do you mean? Dalton's voice was heavy. Thomas Grady had friends in the territorial government. Her stomach dropped. They'll call this murder. Dalton nodded slowly. They already have. The arrest. Days later, riders arrived from Cheyenne territory. Marshals, their badges glinted in the afternoon sun as they rode into Red Hollow. The entire town gathered in the street again, but this time, the whispers were different. No one called Clara a liar anymore. No one mocked Caleb. Instead, people watched quietly as the lead marshal dismounted. He approached Sheriff Dalton. You Dalton? That's right. We're here for Caleb Hartley. Clara's heart clenched. The marshal held up a document, warrant for the murder of Thomas Grady. The crowd murmured uneasily. Dalton looked frustrated. You should read the full story before making decisions. The marshal shook his head. My job's not deciding the story. He pointed toward Caleb. It's taking him in. Caleb stepped forward. Calmly, Clara rushed toward. No, Caleb looked down at her gently. It's all right. They'll hang you, maybe. She grabbed his arm desperately. We have proof. Caleb glanced toward the survey map in Dalton's hands. Proof won't matter to men who've already made up their minds. The marshal approached with iron cuffs. Clara felt tears filling her eyes. You can't just leave. Caleb smiled softly. I'm not leaving you. The cuffs snapped around his wrists. But I might not come back. The ride-away marshals prepared to leave before sunset. Caleb sat on a horse with his hands bound. Clara stood beside him in the street. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she whispered, I should have never come to Red Hollow. Caleb shook his head. If you hadn't, no one would know the truth. But look what it cost you. Caleb looked out toward the open prairie, the land he loved, the ranch he had built with his own hands, the quiet life that was now gone. Then, he looked back at Clara. Somehow, his voice stayed steady. Some things are worth the cost. Clara wiped her tears angrily. I won't let them hang you. Caleb chuckled softly. You planning to fight the entire territory government? If I have to, the marshal shouted, "Time to move." The horses began turning toward the road leading out of town. Clara suddenly ran forward. She grabbed Caleb's shirt and kissed him, hard, desperate. The town gasped when she pulled away. Her voice trembled. "Wait for me." Caleb looked into her eyes. "I always will." Then the marshals rode away, and Clara Whitmore watched the man she loved disappear into the endless western horizon. 6 months later, winter came to the plains. Snow covered the golden grasslands surrounding Blackwood Ranch. The town of Red Hollow had changed in many ways. Without Thomas Grady, the balance of power had shifted. New ranchers arrived, old secrets surfaced, but one story remained unfinished. Inside the small courthouse in Cheyenne, a trial was taking place. Clara Whitmore sat in the front row. Her hands held the survey map tightly. After months of traveling, arguing, and fighting through endless legal hearings, today was the final decision. The judge leaned forward. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented." Clara held her breath. "Samuel Price's survey confirms that Thomas Grady attempted to seize Blackwood Ranch illegally," the courtroom murmured. "Furthermore, multiple witnesses confirmed that Grady and his hired men attacked Caleb Hartley first." Clara's heart pounded. The judge struck the gavel. "Therefore, this court rules that Caleb Hartley acted in self-defense." The words echoed through the room. "He is a free man." Clara burst into tears. Across the courtroom, Caleb Hartley stood motionless. For a moment, he looked almost stunned. Then his eyes found Clara in the crowd, and for the first time since the trial began, he smiled. The legend of Red Hollow Spring returned to the prairie months later. Wildflowers bloomed across the hills surrounding Blackwood Ranch. 2 riders crossed the open fields together. Caleb Hartley rode beside Clara Whitmore. The wind moved gently through the grass. Clara looked around at the wide land stretching forever beneath the sky. "Do you ever regret telling the truth that day?" she asked. Caleb thought about it, about the jail,